Presenting today's webinar, Streamlining Supplier Registration as part of Albertsons Safeway Finance Business Transformation are Danny Thompson and Gregg Maxwell. Our first presenter is Danny Thompson, Senior Vice President of Market and Product Strategy at Apexanalytix. Also presenting today is Gregg Maxwell, Group Vice President of Albertsons National Service Center. So without further ado, I am pleased to turn the program over to Danny Thompson. Take it away, Danny.
Thank you, Patricia. In a moment, I'll give you a more thorough introduction of our featured speaker, but I thought I'd just start out, take this opportunity to say it's great to be with all of you on the call today, and for many of you, it's great to be with you again. Apex has been a long-term partner with retailers going back over 30 years. We're supporting about 250 companies overall, and specific to retail, we're supporting 2 of the top 3 global retail companies, 2 of the top 3 global food companies, 2 of the top 10 apparel companies, and 2 of the top 3 global logistics companies. All told, these companies are protecting about $6.4 trillion in spend each year. That's the number from last year. Using Apex software and audit services, they prevented or recovered over $3 billion in overpayments and onboarded and validated, maintained, and continuously monitored the vendor masters for over 4 million suppliers. A key component of our recovery and vendor management solutions is high quality supplier data and predictive analytics. And to help support that, we have a database which we maintain that contains golden records for over 32 million suppliers to the world's largest companies. And they're integrated with over 650 external data sources to help us make sure the data is valid and we have the best insights into suppliers. This is all supported with 10 million direct conversations with suppliers each year to validate and enrich that data, look for overpayments, and help them on board to clients' systems. Just a little bit about Apex Solutions. We're going to be spending our time today really focused on Apex Portal, but it helps a little bit to understand the other products in the Apex environment because they all are directly related to the Apex Portal. Apex started out 30 years ago in the AP recovery audit business, really helping companies identify control gaps and recovering overpayments that had slipped through the normal controls of their processing environments. And after about 30 years of growth in that business, now Apex performs more commercial AP recovery audits than any provider in the world. And a key to the success in that area is the attention that we pay to suppliers, supplier data, who are the ones that are creating issues, and then the importance of protecting important supplier relationships in the recovery audit process. The software we created to help support that audit business is it's called First Strike. And about 10 years into the company history, our clients asked us to really sort of flip this recovery audit model on its head, and instead of recovering money after the fact, let them run the software day in and day out to really prevent those overpayments from going out the door in the first place. And so that's what we did. We kind of, put some makeup on it, gave it a nice little brand name, and then companies, we've continued to innovate our audit business and the software. And the software helps these individual companies prevent tens of millions of dollars in overpayments each year. And to really put a number on it that's digestible, we looked at all of the overpayments prevented with this software last year, and for every $1 billion in spend that our clients were spending, they found an average of $2 million in overpayments that their ERPs and their normal control processes had not caught. So this software, over time, we added a composite supplier scoring model that highlights suspicious activity and fraud, and introduced around that same time an online supplier inquiry solution where suppliers can view invoice and payment status rather than calling the AP help desk. And about 5 years ago, we went to our customer advisory board, and this is a group of 20 or so directors and VPs of shared services, procurement, and IT, and we asked, what problem are you trying to solve that you can't find a solution for on the marketplace? And it kind of surprised us. They told us they needed to solve the complex supplier onboarding, compliance, and fraud prevention problem that they were facing. And they didn't really find that the end-to-end P2P networks were really solving that problem for them, because they needed a solution that was built to accommodate really change in policies and regulations over time and support a really complex global regulatory environment. So together, we worked with our clients and we created what's turned into an award-winning supplier portal solution that supports 100% of their suppliers, enforces 100% of their supplier policies, and integrates to any solution, especially if they have multiple ERPs in the source-to-pay ecosystems of these companies. A key to the Apex portal is a focus on making sure that the data on a vendor record is accurate. So we try to validate every piece of information possible in the supplier profile before allowing that information into our clients' vendor masters. And this includes connecting to over 650 external data sources to validate things like tax IDs and bank accounts and who owns those bank accounts, diversity codes, parent-child relationships, government watch list, and really anything we can find an external data source for. This integration is what we call Smart VM, and it includes not only the external data integration, but it integrates to our own internal database of 32 million supplier records, and which includes really valuable information like who are the best contacts at the supplier, what are some predictive analytics about those suppliers. And that Smart VM solution is used in supplier onboarding, and anytime a vendor master record is changed in the Apex portal. It can also be used as a one-time vendor master cleanse and continuous monitoring solution. So specifically today, we're going to be focused on supplier portal best practice, the case for a portal-based supplier registration solution, and how Albertsons is streamlining supplier management. And then at the end, we'll have some time for Q&A. Specifically about Albertsons, most of you are familiar with Albertsons. Safeway and Albertsons completed a merger in January of 2015, and they brought together 20 well-known brands all under the Albertsons umbrella. You see these really in many of your own communities. Albertsons has 285,000 employees, and they're serving customers in over 2,000 stores, over 20 distribution facilities, and 20 manufacturing plants in 34 states and the District of Columbia And last year, all told, Albertsons produced about $62.5 billion in revenue. So one little bit of trivia for you about Albertsons is the story of the founder of Albertsons and who he worked for before he opened his first store. And the answer is, in 1939, a former district manager from Safeway, a guy named Joe Albertson, combined $5,000 he had saved and $7,500 he borrowed from his wife's Aunt Bertie, and partnered with L.S. Skaggs to open his first Albertson store on 16th and State Streets in Boise, Idaho. So that's about Albertsons. And now it's my pleasure to introduce you to our guest speaker today, a great guy, Gregg Maxwell. Gregg is Group Vice President of the Albertsons National Service Center. He's responsible for all retail accounting processes, leads the strategic direction of Shared Service Center with 9 directors and a team of 515. Before the Albertsons Safeway merger, Gregg was in essentially the same role, a very similar role for Safeway. So he came out of the Safeway world. He has over 30 years of management, international, and financial experience as a really recognized best practice leader among peers in this space. And we're really pleased that Gregg is often a guest at our Elite Best Practices conferences. He's spoken on several topics related to retail financial shared services, as well as just general financial shared services, because in some ways, the processes that we're talking about today cross industries. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Gregg. Gregg?
Great, thanks, Danny. Hey, it's great to be with everyone. Thanks for taking a few minutes to hear our story and enable me to share some details about the partnership that Albertsons Safeway has had with Apex through supplier management. We've had a long relationship with Apex. It goes back into the early 2000s when I was with Safeway, and our first formal partnership started when we licensed the supplier inquiry software back in 2007. Back then, I was looking for a way to automate the inquiries that were coming in from a growing number of suppliers that we had. And we found that many of the questions could be answered online as opposed to getting phone calls into our shared service center by using the Apex software. And so we selected Apex as our supplier or vendor to streamline that process. We immediately had productivity and headcount benefits. In fact, we reduced our incoming calls to the service center by over 80%. And we're able to reduce 8 headcount over the first 4 months of the project. Over the years, we enhanced the software. We integrated it with our internal help desk system, ServiceNow, and more recently, we just completed we're in the process of completing the Apex upgrade to the software, and now have functionality that gives us more information on the supplier, who's inquiring into the system, their location, and the number of inquiries that they make, so we can actually track who's using the system as we go forward. Some of the major changes that came about as our company grew. We had ongoing business processes improvements at Safeway, and we're always looking for new ways to improve our retail accounting, reduce our claims, expedite processes, and mitigate risk. We were well positioned when the Albertsons and Safeway merged and came together in January of 2015. At that time, then, we had to bring on about 900 new stores into our shared service center. So our first task was to complete that integration of Albertsons into our in-house accounting system following the merger. We completed that process in 2018, and then through the last 2019 and into early 20, we've been working on new ways to improve our productivity at our shared service center. We're now in the middle of replacing our Lawson ERP with Oracle Cloud. We're about halfway through that process, expect to go live in March of 2021. But as we were going through this process, we found some immediate opportunities when it came to vendor data and supplier management. Through the integration of the two companies, our vendor data was in 4 separate systems. And so supplier setup involved 15 different documents flowing through 10 different departments. Very complicated process. Our vendor master had 170,000 records or vendors that were out there, which we have since reduced to 70,000 active vendors. In 2019, after the merger, when we had the two companies together, we added 20,000 vendors and made 12,000 vendor changes. And that's pretty typical, actually, in our business with the number of vendors we have to make that many additions and that many vendor changes. So through this all, we really needed a new supplier onboarding strategy because historically it's all been paper-based and very manual. But before I go into the details of how we did that, let me hand it back over to Danny.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, it's kind of quite a challenge with so many systems and documents involved in supplier onboarding and a large number of suppliers and supplier changes. And you know, that's what we see quite a bit. You know, the number of vendor master changes somewhere in the, say, 15 to 20% of overall supplier accounts. And you know, that's what the Apex portal was designed to help with. Here you see so the solution with all of its modules. Clients have asked us to add functionality over time. We started out with registration, which is our focus today. And across the top, you can see a set of modules that Gartner generally refers to this segment as supply-based management. It includes supplier pre-registration, supplier onboarding, and master data management, which is what we call registration. Supplier risk and performance management are part of that suite as well. To the bottom right are supplier self-service modules. We talked a little bit about the inquiry solution for invoice and payment tracking for suppliers in their own language 24/7. Then in addition to that, we have e-invoicing for the long tail, a repository for sharing contracts and miscellaneous documents with suppliers, getting them to sign those documents, workflow them, whatever's required. And then bottom left, it's all about payments, just an early payment solution, and then overpayment and audit handling. Apex portal, it's flexible, and so modules can be implemented independently. And most companies choose the specific modules to meet their specific needs. And this applies to Albertsons as well, which chose to implement our two most popular modules, really, registration and inquiry. So Greg, just tell us more about what your requirements and were and what the selection process was for a solution.
Yeah, will do, Danny. So like I mentioned, we really needed a new supplier onboarding strategy in our company. And so to get started, we listed out some of the requirements that we wanted in our solution. And you can see them there on the screen. I'll walk through them real quickly, but I know you can read them. And these are probably requirements or additions that each of us want in our company. Improving our cycle time, reducing the amount of paper, which is really important today, so you don't have people coming in the office since most of us are probably still working from home. Eliminating duplicate vendor records. Risk avoidance. This was probably one of the biggest requirements. I have it listed forth, but it's probably number one on the list, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a few minutes. But having risk avoidance checks in the system and performing validations, everything from TIN numbers to address validation, bank accounts, things like that. You know, we were ultimately responsible for achieving all the objectives that we listed here, but we wanted a solution that provided the most automation, extensive validations and verifications to save us the most time possible. And like I said, not having paper, today we had checklists and we received paper that had to get either emailed or mailed in. We were trying to reduce some of that manual effort. When we looked at Apex, we were very impressed with the broad scope of validations and verifications that were performed by the Apex Portal Supplier Registration, and that's what we decided to go ahead and license and implement, mainly because of all of the validations that it performed. Danny, maybe you can go ahead and cover some of the validations and risk checks that are available with the registration process.
Yeah, so, you know, there's so many pieces of information in a vendor master. It's really impossible for a human to get all of that data validated in any sort of reasonable time. And so to help support that requirement, we've worked to try to automate the validation of every piece of data that's on a vendor master. And this picture shows you a subset of the integrations and real-time validations that are part of the solution. Just following the wheel counterclockwise, you can see that SmartVM integrates with address books for every country in the world. And we do that to ensure that addresses are entered accurately and to flag up suspicious addresses like prison addresses or PO box farms, or maybe if you've got a large strategic supplier, but the address they've provided is in a residential neighborhood, that could signify a problem. Then we've got the integration to politically exposed persons lists. So this helps you monitor for potential cases of bribery in your business. Integrated with 90, and this list continuously grows, of prohibited watch lists. So these are vendors that the US government or other countries around the world are are suppliers that they say you're not allowed to do business with, whether it's terrorists or criminals or whatever the case may be. And the fines for doing business with those guys can be fairly steep. I've seen numbers between $650,000 and $1 million for every violation, and up to 20 years in prison. So monitoring that's important. Integrated with the Secretary of State sites and 56 countries for tax ID validation, and is the legal entity still valid and open for business? Then leading industry code and company firmographics database to populate industry codes and parent-child relationships, things like that, so you know who you're doing business with and how they relate to one another. Then a global bank routing and bank account ownership validation, and that bank account ownership validation is pretty, we think it's pretty revolutionary. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a slide to come. We have risk monitoring that taps global news sources around the world that leverages IBM Watson. And then we're also integrated to the Small Business Administration and government contracting databases. So we use all of those data sources and more to either validate vendor data or append data to the vendor master to make sure it's as fully formed as possible. I mentioned the bank account ownership validation. It's one component of a full matrix of controls that are in place with the portal to help defend against fraud. Fraud, it's always been a problem in AP, and the risk has been really only growing over the last few years. Before the coronavirus crisis struck, the FBI had reported nearly a doubling of email-based fraud attempts on businesses in 2019, attempting to get companies to change bank accounts on vendor records and get those payments sent to the fraudster's bank account instead of legitimate suppliers. And since the crisis, they've reported an even sharper increase, with nearly a 300% increase in business fraud attempts. And that's really been a result of two things: either company standard processes, which have been disrupted by people working from home, and also just the shutting down of lots of other avenues to commit fraud. So apexportal prevents fraud in many ways. I mean, first and foremost, it shuts down the channels that bad actors most commonly use to commit fraud. And here I'm talking about phone calls and emails, and in the case of internal bad actors, people who can make direct updates to vendor master details. And so when companies deploy the apexportal registration module, they immediately shut down all of those other pathways. They switch to a model where every bank account change has to be entered by the supplier on the portal using their secure account credentials. And if they email or call the help desk, they're just told, I'm sorry, for security reasons, we don't accept changes on the phone or by email. You've got to go to the portal. And then the portal incorporates this wide range of data protection and fraud controls to really ensure that only valid users are making the updates and entering bank accounts. And a few controls that you might not see in every portal solution option out there are a robust multi-factor authentication. So if someone's trying to make a bank account change from a new device, then there's an MFA. User IP address monitoring, whitelist and blacklisting of IP addresses, but also of banks in specific countries, or it may be specific banks that are known to cater to fraudsters. And working with our clients up to this point, we know who those banks are. And, you know, of course, fraudsters, they're really creative and continuously innovating. And sometimes fraudsters are insiders within the supplier organization or even your own company. And they may be able to get around some of these controls. So I mentioned bank account ownership validation. At the prompting of one of our clients, we partnered with a consortium of banks to create what we think is really a game-changing bank account change control, in that when a supplier enters in their banking information and bank account information, we in real time reach out to the bank and have the bank confirm that the legal name and entity type that's on the supplier record matches the legal name and entity type and authorized signers on the payee bank account. And they also check to see if the bank account was recently opened. And they have their own potential fraud and suspicious activity flags that get thrown up as well. And using that check kind of creates an unprecedented level of assurance that the payments that you're making are going where they're supposed to go. So that's a pretty cool innovation that is just part of an overall change control environment inside the portal. All right, so that's a lot of detail. Let's take a retail break. Just a quiz on a smaller matter. So look at this image here, which we found on Pinterest, PR. And the question for you is, what retail innovation does this image represent? And I'm sure many of you will know that we're looking at Pinterest, but within Pinterest, we're looking at a growing technology in retail called visual search, where the user sees a product in action somehow, they click on that part of the image, and the solution gives them access to retailers who offer that product or something similar to it. And according to Forbes, in their September 2019 article, they said that data shows 62% of millennials want the ability to use visual search, and they want to use that over any other technology. While Gartner research predicts that somewhere around 30% of all searches will be queryless as soon as the end of 2020. So by queryless, they won't be keying in text. They'll be clicking on images to execute queries or execute searches. And really, as consumer habits are shifting around, online product discovery, retailers like you guys are taking note of that. The visual market's expected to exceed $25 billion this year. And by 2021, data indicates retailers are projected to increase their digital commerce revenue by 30% if they adopt the visual search capabilities. All right, so back to AP, Gregg, you told us about the challenge at Albertsons, the requirements you had for a solution, some of the controls in apexportal. Take us through the 2B supplier onboarding process at Albertsons.
Sure, will do, Danny. So it's really not that complicated. I'll walk through the workflow here and kind of mention where we are today and what we're headed towards. So even today, a requester invites a supplier. So our procurement team or our buyer sends an invitation to a supplier, either because we want that supplier or the supplier's inquired into Albertsons saying they would like to be a supplier. So today, what we would do is we would send them a link, which would give them a bunch of paperwork to fill out and either email or mail back to us. So tomorrow, what will happen is that supplier will actually go to a link with Apex. They'll complete a registration. So within that registration, which has been identified by our folks here as exactly what we need, that supplier enters all the required fields and uploads all the required documents right within the Apex tool. So there's no more paper or manual checklists or checking to make sure all the information was received. It's all in the tool. In addition to requiring the supplier to do this, if the supplier doesn't fill out certain fields or doesn't send in the documents, they get an email reminder, again, based on the time period that we identified. But they'll get email reminders every 2 days, every 4 days, once a week until that's done. And they won't be a qualified vendor until they complete all that information that gets turned in. But again, it's got an automated process to ensure that all the data is complete. So then if you go to the middle box, the approval process, again, based on the supplier characteristics and the validation of all the results, we never have to touch that information. It'll be automated through this workflow process and driven by the business rules that we've identified. And then once that supplier is approved, either automated or manually, depending on, again, how you want to adjust the system, then that information is pushed to all of our other internal systems as required. So whether it goes to your ERP or if you have some legacy systems also that you need that information in, you can push that. In our case, it goes into Oracle. That's how we're building it today. And then they actually become an active supplier.
Yeah, so just talking about some of the more technical aspects of how all of this works, during the inviting process, there's an upfront check to make sure the request contains all the information that it needs to and doesn't appear to be a duplicate. And then a secure link goes to the supplier, and the supplier follows the link to the portal. And then, as the supplier is entering the information, the system is accessing a business rules engine that comes pre-built with 180,000 best practice business rules. But those business rules can be added to or modified to meet your specific needs, and you actually get your own access to the business rules engine in case you want to introduce your own rules or modify rules over time. But based on those business rules, exactly the information that you need for that specific supplier and supplier type, where they are in the world, and based on their responses as they're moving through the registration process, the system decides what to ask them next and what options to provide to them next. And as they're entering the data, as we mentioned before, it's all being validated in real time, and that gives the supplier confidence as they're moving through that their data is valid. And if there's any sort of an error, you know, the error that gets flagged up just helps them correct the data before they submit it and avoid fat finger errors or any other sorts of errors that might otherwise eventually make it into your systems. And then the Apex portal checks a lot of other pieces of information that aren't presented back to the supplier in real time. So these really fall into two categories. One is appended data. So we may add zip4 onto the end of their zip code, or maybe it's industry codes, parent-child relationships, diversity codes. But also the second category is sensitive compliance checks, like is the supplier on an OFAC list, or are they a politically exposed person, or something like that. You wouldn't want to show that information to the supplier. Instead, that information shows up during the intelligent approval workflow process, so the approvers see any exceptions and can evaluate those exceptions before approving the record and feeding the data into the ERP system. Once it's approved, the record goes into, in this case, Oracle or any other ERP systems or other systems you want, and there's a round trip back. So we make sure that the Oracle site IDs and Oracle vendor numbers are kept in sync between the portal and the ERP system over time, so that changes can continue to be made in the future out of the portal. Once all that's done, then a notice goes to the supplier and to the requester saying, hey, the supplier's all set up and you can start doing business. So, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was gonna mention, so the supplier registration for Albertsons is really just one of 15 different transformation projects that we're working on. And Danny, maybe you want to talk a little about the screenshot here, and then I'll kind of walk through what our next steps are.
Sure. So I mentioned that there's an intelligent workflow approval process, and this is just a screen that shows you the validations that appear to the approver. At any time, you can actually pull up a supplier, and there's an indicator. You can sort of see it on the screen behind there in gray. There's some check marks and X's, and if there's a green check mark, that means that all of the validation rules have passed. If there's an X, that means that one or more of the tests has failed. And so then that just creates a one-stop shop for the approver to understand the validation status of the record. And they can drill down on any exceptions to see the details behind that exception. And actually, you can rerun this check on an on-demand basis for a supplier at any given time. It gets run as the supplier's onboarding and anytime the supplier changes something about their profile. Yep.
Okay, thanks, Danny. Yeah, so like I mentioned, the Oracle project is probably our primary transformation project, but we have 15 other projects that we're working on, including robotics, changing our utility partner, a vendor tracking tool, and things like that. But you know, even with the disruption caused by the COVID-19, we've been able to move forward on the implementation of many of these projects, and especially on our Apex registration project. And we plan to register all our vendors through the solution when we go live in September. So finally, let me mention a few of the business benefits that we had hoped to receive from Apex, and given what we know and how we've designed the system now, we believe that we will receive these benefits as we go through the Apex process for our vendors. One is a single source of truth. It's important that, like I said before, we had 4 different systems that housed our vendor information. And now we're going to have one source of truth. Everything will be in one place. Reduce time needed for vendor onboarding, not waiting for documents to be emailed in, sending automatic reminders to the vendors. That's going to improve our speed to market by getting the vendors set up and enabling our stores to receive the product in a timely manner. Eliminating manual tracking of the vendor setup, again, using the workflow process. Reducing invalid vendor information. Not only all the fraud detection and validations, but also just making sure that we have the name correct, that we didn't have any abbreviations, that we have the right address, that we have the right phone numbers. All these duplicate checks using the data, the gold records that Apex has will help us create more valid and accurate vendor information. I mentioned the decrease of handling physical documents since everything's handled electronically, and then electronic management of expiring documents. So in the system, you can also list when you have, say you have a certificate of insurance that's out there, you can put in the expiration date. So it starts pinging the vendor and notifying you 3 months, 4 months, whatever you require the system to do, ahead of the expiration to make sure that that gets taken care of. And then the ability to mass communicate with vendors. We really struggle today if we have something to send out to all of our vendors information-wise. And this tool will enable us to handle that communication in a seamless manner.
Yeah, just on that second bullet, Greg, there's just a bit of data from one of our other clients. They had mentioned, and this, I don't know if this is true for Albertsons, but it's true for a lot of companies. They averaged 4 round trips in their paper process back to either the requester in procurement or the supplier themselves before they got all of the data they needed to onboard a supplier. And so on average, it was taking them something like 28 days to get a supplier onboarded. But with the automated solution, there was none of that back and forth with supplier, and they could onboard suppliers same day within a couple of hours if they needed to. And on average, it was taking them about 3 days to get the supplier to actually log into the portal and complete the process. So that should do exactly what you're trying to do here, which is reduce time for onboarding.
Yeah, you may have gotten that data straight from Albertsons, because that's pretty much what happens here today.
That's funny. Okay, so just kind of winding up here, Apexanalytix is pleased to be recognized by Spend Matters as a best-in-class solution for supplier relationship management and risk. You know, this is really the result of our clients saying, forget what you think you need to build. This is what we really need, and us really collaborating around what the solution should be. And you can see we like to think of this as there's the best and then there's all the rest, because we're being rated on 2 axes. One is the analyst who did a really in-depth RFI and required demos of all the solutions. And then the x-axis on this chart is actual scores from customers who are using the system. And the keys that they highlighted as exceptional for Apexanalytix's portal solution is best-in-class supplier and financial information validation, which we talked about today. The workflow configuration and rules engine that allows everything to be customized or configured for your own business needs, and then a top performing risk modeling and monitoring capability. All right, so with that, I'd like to turn the presentation back over to Patricia for Q&A.
Thank you kindly. And before we begin the Q&A, I do have a short poll that we'd like to put up for the group. If you would take a few moments just to respond to this. And that poll should be open now. Okay, so if you take a moment just to respond to that. And meanwhile, we do have some questions that have come in. The first one is to Gregg. Gregg, how do you expect the supplier registration solution to help you over the course of time as your business continues to evolve?
Thanks, Patricia. We talked about some of the benefits in the presentation, but in addition to that, I think just the ability to be able to handle the amount of volume that comes in with the number of vendors we have, the number of changes. I mentioned we have over 12,000 just changes each year in information, enabling the vendors to self-serve and do that themselves. And then just reducing the chance for any duplicate vendors to be in the system and prevent fraud going forward. I think those are probably the biggest benefits that we're going to get from the supplier registration tool.
Excellent. And also to Gregg, you mentioned that your implementation is going forward, even with some of the disruption that's occurring as a result of COVID-19. What do you attribute that to?
I think the importance of the project. I think the folks in our group in accounts payable that are champions of the project know the importance, and especially not being in the office and everything being more digital, the chance of fraud is it provides more and more opportunity for people to either to submit invalid vendors or vendor changes. And I think everyone's more focused on completing this project because of that importance and getting it up and running.
Understood. And a question here for Danny. Danny, how has Apex seen the fraud and risk environment change recently? And what does the portal do to help to mitigate those risks?
Yeah, so I guess I talked pretty extensively about that already. I mean, we're just really seeing an increase. Just one thing in particular that has been a challenge for companies is the callback process. It's pretty common in companies to have a process where if a bank account change request comes in over the phone or by email, it's common for companies to call a known contact in the supplier organization just to verify that bank account change. But the COVID crisis has kind of changed the ability of that control to work effectively, because who are you calling when you call the supplier back? Most suppliers aren't at their desks anymore. They're either working from home. Well, most commonly they're working from home, and so you're having to call cell phones. And in the case of cell phones or home landlines, those are typically owned by the individual rather than by the company. And with the COVID crisis, it's just impossible to know whether that person is still employed by the supplier. So so if they do answer, if you do have their cell phone number and you can reach them, you still can't rely on that verbal confirmation that the bank account change is valid. So they're having to find other solutions for this, or we've even heard some cases where companies, AP departments, just told their business units that they couldn't take responsibility for the validity of those bank account changes. I can't imagine that's a long-term tenable solution. So we've seen greater dependence on things like integration with the banking system to validate bank account changes.
Got it. Thank you. And we have a question to Gregg. Gregg, what steps did you take to become more efficient at onboarding in order to achieve a 3-day average? Is that initial setup, or does that include the whole gamut?
No, that includes the whole gamut, but I think the key is the original setup when you install registration, that you're clear on exactly the requirements that you have for your vendors. Again, it probably takes a vendor 15 to 20 minutes to fill out the information, assuming they have it at their hand, which they normally do. And so as long as they complete that process and input the information, and then we validate that that it's all there, both through the workflow process and through visual checking. That's what's really cut the time. Like Danny said, prior, you might touch a document 4 times or remind the vendor 4 times that you need something, where now the system handles all that through a workflow process.
Okay, thank you. And kind of a 2-part question. Someone's asking, what is the difference, your difference with Dun & Bradstreet, and how much is the vendor master?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess I'm probably not the person to speak for the Dun & Bradstreet solution itself, but what we hear from clients that's different about our solution than other solutions is the depth of validation that we perform. And one thing that's different that we sometimes hear about D&B data is people don't know how old the data is. And I really didn't mention this, but a key to our Smart VM data set of 32 million suppliers is we score every data field for accuracy and age. So that accuracy score automatically degrades over time if we don't confirm it. So, so for example, if we have contact data for a supplier, or and we get that from the supplier themselves through a phone call that we make to the supplier, then we give it a high rating, a high accuracy rating, because we've confirmed it personally with the supplier, versus finding it on the internet, which might be a lower score. But even that score that we've given for a supplier that we've spoken to and confirmed the data, if we don't confirm it again in 90 days, then we degrade the accuracy score. And what that allows us to do is, if we have multiple contacts for a supplier, we know which one is the most recently confirmed and therefore the most likely to be accurate. And it helps us make automated decisions based on the accuracy of that information. So that's another difference between the D&B typical, what we hear about D&B and what we're doing.
Thank you kindly. And a question to Greg. Greg, what kind of training will you be doing for users of the new registration process? And what will the rollout look like?
So as far as training, most of the training is done internally, and it's broken into a few different methods. We've done some pre-recorded training where people can go out and, again, no one's in the office right now. Everyone's working from home in our company. And so it's a little bit unique, but we did the pre-recorded training so folks can go out and look at what's required. We'll have several Teams meetings. We use Teams here in our company. As far as training for approvers, we'll have different meetings and different pre-recorded trainings for the inviter, and then additional sessions where necessary. But the SMEs, the subject matter experts who perform the UAT, the user acceptance testing through the process, they're going to be responsible for assisting their teams with all the training and questions because they're the champions and the expert of the project. Again, we're using a lot of digital training for our folks. As far as the vendors that use it, it's a pretty self-explanatory walkthrough process. You can't move from one screen to the next until you complete the requirements. There's not a lot of training. I would think of it more as you pick up an iPad. When you buy an iPad, you don't get a training manual. You just start using it. And I think Apex is similar in the fact that it's a very intuitive, user-friendly tool that will be very easy for our vendors to pick up.
And of course, at the end of the day, that's the very best kind to have, right? In terms of a solution, one that's intuitive. All right, and then I do invite, we have a few more minutes left. Just if there's another question, if you would like to put that into the question box, we can get to that. I do have a final one for Danny. Danny, I think you've made some reference to this, but can you explain a little bit more about how the validations work in the portal?
Yeah, I'm not sure what more people need to hear until, probably what they need to do next is see it work. But, one thing that we've talked about, regulatory validations, bank account validations, but one thing we haven't really talked about is the way the portal uses business rules to kind of enforce company policies. For example, payment terms, standard payment terms, requirements. The system is sensitive to what segment the supplier is in. So you can have different default payment terms for different suppliers that get applied automatically as the supplier is being onboarded. And this not only applies to things like payment terms, but you can drive electronic payment methods, and by only offering electronic payment methods to your suppliers if you want, or if there are other initiatives that you have that you want to either offer to suppliers or require suppliers to participate in, then you can do that through configuring business rules that get applied as the supplier is onboarding. So some examples of that might be, let's say you offer a virtual card program for payments, or maybe you need certain categories of suppliers to always use an e-procurement solution for exchanging purchase orders with you. The portal can take the business rules that you've configured and force the supplier to either go register or provide their e-procurement network ID, or we can even automatically reach into those e-procurement solutions and create an account for the supplier. So that's another example of how the validation and policy enforcement capabilities of the business rules engine can be applied to really drive your best practices.
Thank you very much. And I'm watching our time. We are running out of time today. So for those who may have any further questions about the material covered in today's presentation, please feel free to reach out to Danny directly at dthompson@apexanalytix.com. I will be sending out a link to you all to the deck that was used for this webinar, as well as an on-demand recorded version of this webinar once that file is available, hopefully later today. And on behalf of RVCF, Apexanalytix, and Albertsons, we would like to thank you for attending today's webinar. Thank you all and have a great day. Bye all.